Boldwood presents Happy Ever After for the Cornish Midwife, written by Joe Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Imagine being told that you can't have the one thing you've always wanted. The training facilitator looked across the room, and Meg deliberately didn't make eye contact. She could imagine it far too easily. Except that she'd had the one thing she'd always wanted, and it had been taken away from her. That's what infertility is like for so many people. The facilitator was still scanning the room, and even with her head dipped slightly, Meg could see lots of people nodding, including Jess, who was sitting on her right. Jess had first-hand experience of the pain of infertility, and she'd been open about it with Meg since she joined the midwifery unit as a part-time receptionist. Meg did 2 days at the unit and 2 days at the GP surgery, fitting in her studies to become a counsellor around both jobs. It was Jess who'd suggested she come along to the endometriosis awareness training, and Meg had jumped to the chance. Anything that helped her to understand the challenges people were going through was a positive, but this issue was close to home for Meg too. What if there was something you could do that might give you the chance of having a baby after all, even if the timing wasn't right? The facilitator clicked through to the next slide. That's often a predicament faced by young women diagnosed with more severe cases of endometriosis. Meg leant closer to Jess. They've told Tilly not to leave it too long, but she's nowhere near ready to have a baby. She whispered the words to her friend, who shot her a sympathetic look in return. Meg had shared enough in the past for Jess to know why this was such a dilemma for her daughter. Tilly was 23 and had just completed the second part of her solicitor's qualifying exam and had started her 2 years qualifying practice with a small law firm in Port Tremelian. She should be thinking about how to make the most of her 20s and build her career, not choosing whether to gamble with her fertility. Tilly's boyfriend, Ed, was a nice enough lad, but he was only a couple of years ahead of her in training for the same career. It seemed far too early for them to have to decide whether they wanted to link to each other for the rest of their lives. For me, it wasn't just the issue of decreasing infertility. The facilitator shook her head. I knew I couldn't have the treatment that was most likely to reduce my pain until I decided my family was complete. Facing the prospect of getting pregnant or risking infertility when you're only in your 20s is hard enough, but agreeing to have a hysterectomy at a very early age is arguably even harder. I know it was for me. Jess scribbled something on the pad she was holding. She'd been involved in running an infertility support group in Port Agnes for over 3 years, and it was so in demand that GP surgeries from across the region had made contact to see if some of their patients could attend. With the need for support growing, Jess had asked Meg if she'd be willing to help out, and it had seemed like the perfect role to help her develop her counselling skills. She was already volunteering for a bereavement charity, but that wasn't what she wanted to do forever. Meg had spent the last 10 years being defined by bereavement, and making a career out of that had never been her plan. There was a murmur of agreement from around the room at the facilitator's words. The audience were all professionals involved in supporting patients with infertility, and the last segment of the day focused on endometriosis. Willingly choosing to undergo a hysterectomy at a young age probably seemed unimaginable to most of the people in the room. But not Meg. She'd witnessed her daughter in so much pain from her endometriosis that if someone had offered Tilly the solution there and then, she'd probably have taken it just to stop the agony. But Meg knew that her daughter also wanted a family more than anything. A chance to get back what they'd once had, until fate and a freak accident had stolen it from them. Sometimes she dreamed the accident had never happened, and the raw grief would hit her all over again the moment she woke up. If Tilly added to their family, it wouldn't fill the void. But if grief was love with nowhere to go, there'd be a tsunami of love waiting for that baby to arrive. Just the thought of someone new coming into their lives made Meg's eyes sting, but she couldn't work out if the threatened tears were the good kind or the bad. As a GP, I think that's something I need to bear in mind. A woman to the left of Meg directed her response to the facilitator. It's easy for me to tell a young woman with a more severe case of endometriosis that she needs to consider her fertility sooner rather than later if she wants to give herself the best chance of having a child naturally. But I can never fully understand what other factors might be involved in deciding whether or not to try for a baby. Absolutely, it's not the black and white decision that some healthcare providers present it as. The facilitator smiled. That's something for us all to think about over the next coffee break. When we come back, we'll be doing small group work to see if we can come up with some ideas on how to talk to women with endometriosis and other infertility issues, which take into account what those other factors might be. Meg turned to Jess as everyone started to head toward the trestle table at the back of the room, ready to swoop on the drinks and biscuits that had been set out for the break. Thank you so much for swinging it for me to come to this. No problem at all. If we get the funding to start running some counselling sessions at the surgery, all of this is really going to help. Not to mention how important this is to you personally. Jess touched her arm. She was such a force of nature, and Meg would bet her last pound on Jess getting the project off the ground. The GP surgery and midwifery unit were increasingly working in partnership with each other, and they'd identified a huge need to extend the mental health support for patients using both services. Meg had been working at the unit for a year and had only attended 8 infertility support group sessions so far. But Jess had shared from the start how worried she was about the emotional impact of infertility on some of the members, and she was incredibly honest about how her own infertility had affected her. So it had been easy for Meg to share what Tilly was going through. I've got to admit, it's made me think. Meg tucked a strand of chestnut brown hair behind her ear. She'd been adamant that Tilly shouldn't panic and rush into motherhood when she'd brought up the prospect just after she got her exam results. But she could see now that it wasn't as simple as that. Me too, I think training sessions like this are... Jess stopped as Meg's phone started to buzz in her hand. Do you need to get that? It's Tilly, but she knows not to ring me today. Meg looked from the screen to Jess and back again. Cold creeping up her spine for reasons that probably wouldn't occur to anyone else. It was just an unexpected phone call from her daughter, and Tilly had probably forgotten all about the training. But ever since that day when Meg had been given the worst news imaginable, she didn't seem to be capable of expecting anything else, and right now it was like she was frozen to the spot. Her timing's spot on. We've got 15 minutes before the next session, so you can take Tilly's call and I'll get us both a drink and some of those shortbread biscuits before all we're left with are oat cakes. Thank you. Meg's hand shook as she reached out to press the button to connect the call. Her heart was hammering, despite telling herself there was nothing to worry about. Hey, Tills, what's up? Is that Mrs. Sawyer? The voice didn't belong to her daughter. It was male for a start, and Meg's racing heartbeat broke into a gallop. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Somehow she managed to mumble a response. Uh-huh. Now don't worry. His words had the opposite of their intended effect. She couldn't think of a single reason why a stranger would be calling her on Tilly's phone if there was nothing to worry about. But I'm ringing because Tilly collapsed at work. Collapsed! The word came out as a shriek, and Meg was vaguely aware of people looking in her direction, but she didn't give a damn. She just needed to know that Tilly was alive. Sorry, I'm not putting this very well. It was probably more of a faint. She's awake and talking now and she seems fine, but she won't let us call an ambulance. You're listed on Tilly's HR file as her next of kin, and we thought maybe you could persuade her to get checked out properly. The man cleared his throat. We don't want her driving home after this. Don't let her move until I get there. Meg wasn't going to waste time trying to talk sense into Tilly over the phone. She wanted to see her daughter with her own eyes and make sure she was okay. Once she got there, Meg would carry Tilly out and strap her into the car herself, like she was a toddler again, if she had to. She'd be going to hospital to get checked over whether she liked it or not. How long do you think you'll be? Tilly seems pretty determined that she's okay to drive. The man on the other end of the phone sounded doubtful, and something about his tone helped the tension in Meg's shoulders to relax. He wasn't worried about Tilly being okay. He was worried that they wouldn't be able to stop her leaving until Meg arrived. Nothing stood in Tilly's way when she'd made up her mind. I'll be 20 minutes at the most. Meg caught Jess's eye. She'd explain everything later, but Tilly needed her. When that happened, there wasn't a single thing in the world that could stand in Meg's way either. Chapter 2. Jess had insisted on driving Meg to Port Tremelian because Meg had been shaking so much. Despite the relief she'd felt at hearing that Tilly was being her usual feisty self, the adrenaline was still coursing through her veins as memories of a different day came flooding back. Except that had started with 2 police officers standing on her doorstep, looking as if they wished they were anywhere else. "I'm so sorry, but..." The young police sergeant had seemed to be speaking in slow motion, but a scream from somewhere stopped him in his tracks. Meg didn't even realise where the sound was coming from until the female police officer put her arms around her. The next 10 minutes or so were a blur of Meg begging the 2 police officers to admit that they might have got it wrong, and that the bodies pulled from the rubble of the old house her husband Darren had been working on didn't belong to him or their teenage son. Seth had been so keen to earn extra money that he'd volunteered to help out in his father's construction business every school holiday. He should have been on the beach in Port Agnes, trying to get girls to notice him like the rest of his friends from the local high school. But instead, at just 15, he'd been pulled, grey and lifeless, from beneath a mountain of bricks that had left him and his father no chance of survival. The bargaining had started from the moment the police had arrived on the doorstep. It wouldn't be them. It couldn't be. Meg had even insisted on identifying her husband and son. There was no way she'd have believed it if someone else had done it instead of her. Some of the professionals had advised her not to go and see Seth, but she'd gone in anyway, leaning heavily on the arm of her mother, who was all but holding her up. Even now, 10 years down the line, she wasn't sure if she'd made the right decision. Her beautiful boy had looked so perfect in many ways, and the coroner's report had concluded that Darren had almost certainly tried to shield his son when the wall started to collapse. It hadn't been enough, though, and both her husband and son had suffered fatal blunt force injuries as a result of falling masonry. Megan had read the report more times than she could count, but nothing changed the verdict. Her only consolation was that it was likely to have been very quick. She hated the thought that either of them would have had time to have been scared, especially Seth. He was still her baby, even at 15 and almost 6 feet tall. To her, he'd always be the little boy who'd had nightmares about Power Rangers when he'd been 6 or 7, and had crept into her bed for a cuddle when he couldn't sleep. Looking down at him lying there, she'd wanted to try and shake him awake. But nothing she could do would bring him or Darren back. It was in the months afterwards that she'd regretted seeing them both, because it meant she'd forgotten how to picture them as they were, before they were lying there in that room with all the life drained out of them. Darren and Seth had been so alike, their sandy blonde hair and ready smiles meaning they'd been mistaken for brothers more than once. They'd both been taken far too early. She and Darren had been launched into parenthood at a young age, but they'd taken to it better than she'd ever dared hope. Despite not planning for family life, Seth had been an easily contented baby, so it hadn't been a hard decision to try for a second baby a little more than a year afterwards. Tilly was born exactly 9 days after her brother turned 2, and Meg had counted her blessings many times over the next 13 years. She and Darren had grown together instead of apart, and as his small construction firm became more established, the money worries they'd had in their early days together had become a thing of the past. They'd had it all, and had even seemed blessed with teenagers who weren't terminally embarrassed by their parents. The week before Darren and Seth died, they'd celebrated Tilly's 13th birthday. Everything had been right in the world. But in an instant, it had gone more horribly wrong than Meg could ever have imagined. For a long time, she hadn't been sure she would survive losing her boys, and if it hadn't been for Tilly, she probably wouldn't have. But somehow they kept each other going. At first, it was all they could do to get through each day and Meg didn't plan anything beyond that. Thinking too far ahead just reminded her of what was missing from the future she'd always envisaged. But gradually that started to change. She needed to help Tilly make plans for her future. Time couldn't stand still, even if Meg had wanted it to. And eventually she'd realised she had to move forward too. Otherwise, when Tilly left home, she'd have nothing. Having her own counselling had been a life raft for Meg, and she'd been 3 years into it when she'd started to think about training to counsel other people. Darren's life insurance had meant that Meg hadn't needed to work while Tilly was still at school, but she'd taken on a part-time job at the GP surgery to give her days some new meaning. Then, just before Tilly had left for uni, Meg had started studying online, and now she had a psychotherapy degree and had started her counselling training. On the 7th anniversary of the accident, during an evening at a friend's house where they drunk far too much wine, Meg had done something she'd never have dreamt of and set up an online dating profile. If the Chablis hadn't slipped down so easily, Meg wouldn't have agreed to it. The dating hadn't worked out quite as planned, and she'd ended up bursting into tears on the first date she'd been on. But it had opened her mind to the possibility that she might be ready to meet someone. And now here she was, over 2.5 years into a relationship with a man who was born the same month she'd started secondary school. Her friends thought it was hilarious and teased her fairly relentlessly about her toy boy. But Johnny had taken Meg completely by surprise. She'd realised how much younger Johnny was long before they'd started dating. But it had been part of what had made him feel safer than any of the profiles she'd matched with online. In her mind, the difference in their ages meant there was no chance of them falling in love, or of it turning into anything serious. No one could ever replace Darren, and she didn't want to try. Except she hadn't reckoned on Johnny turning out to be one of the best people she'd ever met. What he saw in Meg was a complete mystery. Eventually he'd move on and want the life he'd been missing out on if he stayed with her. He'd be a great dad, and she wouldn't stand in his way when he worked that out for himself. In the meantime, she was doing her best to try to enjoy it while it lasted and not rely on him too much, even though her first instinct after getting the call about Tilly had been to phone Johnny for support. She was on dangerous ground, but it had already been too late by the time she'd realised it. "She's going to be okay, isn't she?" Meg looked at Jess as she brought the car to a stop outside the offices where Tilly's law firm was based. "Of course she is." Jess gave her a reassuring smile, and Meg took a deep breath. Everything was going to be okay. The worst had happened a long time ago, and no one could be that unlucky twice. Jess, a barely 5 feet tall, was having trouble keeping up with Meg, who was at least 8 inches taller and had stridden ahead once they'd reached the front door of Parton, Woodley and Thwaite. She could understand her friend's anxiety. Anyone getting a phone call like that about someone they loved would worry. But after what had happened to Meg's husband and son, Jess couldn't even imagine how terrified she must be. It was why Jess had happily left the training early, despite spending weeks arranging it. She didn't want Meg driving with so much running through her head, and Jess might be able to reassure her that a hospital visit wasn't necessary, or even help persuade Tilly that it was. The receptionist ushered them through a door, and Meg launched herself towards the young woman sitting on a sofa in what looked like a waiting area for clients. "I'm so glad you're okay, sweetheart. That phone call nearly finished me off." "Oh, Mum, you didn't have to drive all the way here." Tilly had the same high cheekbones and dark brown eyes as her mother, but with long blonde hair closer to the colour of Jess's and in her elegant navy blue suit, she looked a picture of professionalism. "Like I was going to sit around and wait after a call like that." Meg shook her head. "This is Jess, by the way. We were at the training together and she kindly drove me over. Sorry you got dragged here unnecessarily too, but thank you anyway. I've heard loads about you from Mum." Tilly held out her hand and smiled. "You too." Jess shook the younger woman's hand, and it was no problem. "How are you feeling now? Still dizzy?" Meg reached up and put a hand on Tilly's forehead. "You don't feel like you've got a temperature?" "I'm fine. I got a bit lightheaded, that's all, and everyone panicked unnecessarily." Tilly sighed. "I just need a good night's sleep." What you need is to get checked out properly, young lady. Meg's tone brooked no argument, but it didn't stop Tilly from shaking her head. I don't need to, Mum. I'm fine, I promise. Are you a qualified doctor? Meg raised her eyebrows. No, I thought not. So if you don't mind, I'd rather get the opinion of a professional than take your word for it. Tell her it would be a waste of the doctor's time, Jess, and we've done enough of that over the years. Tilly gave her a pleading look, but it was clearly going to take more than Jess's opinion to dissuade Meg. Luckily, she had an idea. Most fainting episodes are down to low blood pressure. I've got my bag in the car, so I can run a few tests to check your blood pressure, your heart rate and your oxygen levels. And if you're up for doing a urine sample, I can even check your blood sugar level, as that can make you feel faint too if it drops too low. If all of that's okay, then I'd say you'd be safe to make a follow-up appointment with your GP rather than an urgent one. That's a plan I can live with, Meg smiled. But Tilly was looking as if she might make a bolt for the door at any moment. Will the urine test show up anything else? Like what? Even as Jess said the words, she knew what Tilly was asking, and a split second later it clicked for Meg too. Oh my God, are you pregnant? She was waiting for the answer, but her daughter's face gave away the secret before she even spoke. I was going to tell you, but I wanted to wait until the right time. Tilly looked at her mother, and for a moment the whole world seemed to stop. Jess held her breath, hoping that however Meg reacted, she wouldn't say something she might end up regretting for a very long time. That's amazing, darling. Congratulations. The words coming out of Meg's mouth were the right ones, but her eyes were wide, and when she folded her daughter into her arms, she looked over Tilly's shoulder and caught Jess's eye. She was shocked, but desperately trying not to show it, and all Jess could do was nod, hoping that it would convey her belief that everything would turn out okay in the end. Jess had cared for enough women over the years to know that even the most surprising of pregnancies almost always worked out if the expectant mother wanted to go ahead. And she was as sure as she could be that Tilly's would too. Chapter 3. Jess had been worried about Meg ever since Tilly had announced her pregnancy. She'd texted her a few times, and her friends' responses had said all the right things, but she had a nagging feeling they didn't tell the full story. Jess was looking forward to seeing Meg in person to see for herself how her friend was coping with the news. When you'd lost part of your family, the way Meg had, change could have an unexpected consequence. Guilt. Darren and Seth would never meet the new member of the family that was on the way. The baby represented a future that his uncle and grandfather would never be a part of, and Jess knew Meg would be blindsided by that. It had been the same for Jess when she'd met her husband, Dexter, and later on when they'd adopted his stepson, Riley. The one person Jess had wanted to talk to about it all was her mother, but that choice had been taken away from Jess when she was still just a child herself. Growing up in a series of foster homes, Jess understood better than anyone how important family was. That sense of belonging had disappeared when Jess's mother had died, and she didn't even have any siblings to share her childhood memories with. It was why she was determined that Riley wouldn't grow up as an only child. Jess had been told that there was no chance of her conceiving naturally, and she was 4 rounds of IVF treatment down, with no baby to show for it. So she and Dexter were looking into another adoption. Riley's birth mother had died in a car accident, and when his biological father had decided that parenting full-time wasn't for him, it had fallen to Dexter to take on that role. Adopting again felt like a good fit for them, but the social workers had to be convinced that they'd come to terms with not having any biological children of their own before they could be considered to adopt for a second time. And the truth was, Jess wasn't sure she was there yet. All of that was why she could understand just how conflicted Meg might be. This new baby wouldn't replace Darren or Seth, but they'd eventually fill an empty space at the table. Most families weren't as complicated as hers or Meg's, so she needed her friend to know that it was okay to have mixed feelings and that she could share them with Jess if she wanted to. I think Anna's going to give us an update on the progress of merging services with the hospital today. Tony, one of the other midwives, came into the staff room carrying a tray laden with mugs of tea. Meg was behind her, carrying a second tray with 2 packets of biscuits and more mugs, which were filling the air with the unmistakable scent of coffee. "I know I'm the one nearing retirement." Gwen, the oldest midwife on the team, narrowed her eyes. "But you're looking older than me these days, Tony." "What, you mean all the excess baggage under my eyes? That's what you get when you got 2 kids under the age of 3. Tony yawned, as if to emphasise her point. "I don't know what's happened to the time since they announced we were finally getting a hospital in the Three Ports area, but I can't believe it's been nearly 2 years. I didn't think there was any chance of it being finished before I retired, but who knows, I might even manage a handful of shifts before you lot pat me off with a tartan blanket, a case of hemorrhoid cream and a year's supply of Werther's Originals." Gwen shook her head, and Jess couldn't help laughing. Gwen might not be far off her 70th birthday, but she was probably the youngest at heart of all the midwives and was infamous for her near-the-knuckle remarks that made everyone except Gwen squirm. "I think we all know that your leaving gifts are more likely to be body glitter, vodka and underwear that could double up as dental floss." Tony's words echoed what Jess was thinking, and Gwen clapped her hands together. "You girls do know me after all." "Are you still planning to volunteer at the hospital after you retire?" Anna, who managed the unit, turned towards Gwen as she spoke. "Yes, I'm all signed up to run the Friends of the Hospital shop on Wednesdays, but I might take on a few more shifts. I'm hoping I'll get the chance to see a bit more of Ella, too. I still miss her so much." Gwen sighed. "I know she's only up the road, but if I'm missing her as much as I do, how am I going to cope without you lot?" "I've got a feeling we'll see you all the time." Jess gave Gwen's waist a squeeze. They'd all missed Ella since she'd retrained as a health visitor and started working out of the GP surgery. But with the unit working in partnership with local surgeries for more and more of their services, it meant they still got to see quite a lot of her. Gwen would always be welcomed back at the unit too. But Jess had no idea if her friend would find time to pop back in when it came to it. Gwen had more hobbies than the rest of them put together, and she was already running belly dancing classes a couple of times a week in the Port Agnes Community Centre. She'd been talking about starting up pole dancing classes once she retired, but not even Gwen had been able to persuade the parish council to fit a row of poles at the back of the hall. Not yet, anyway. "I don't know about anyone else, but I'm desperate to hear what the plan is for working with the maternity team at the hospital. I just hope it's going to be okay." Izzy, who'd started working at the unit 3 years before, exchanged a look with Jess. There'd been a lot of rumour and guesswork ever since the hospital had been given the go-ahead, including a suggestion that the midwifery unit would be fully integrated with the hospital. There was a desperate need for emergency maternity care in the area, and it had already been confirmed that the hospital would have 4 operating rooms, mostly catering for day and planned surgery, with some emergency surgery cover for both obstetrics and trauma. The new hospital was taking over the services of the old cottage hospital, but the departments had been broadened out to include oncology and Macmillan nursing, renal and stroke units, and mental health services. It still wasn't going to be like one of the huge general hospitals in other parts of the country, but it would be amazing for a community that had been forced to rely on the hospital in Truro for any kind of urgent care. The plans Jess had seen for the Three Ports Hospital looked similar to some of the rural Scottish hospitals in terms of size and services. Many of those hospitals had a model of fully integrated maternity services, which potentially put the unit at risk. So Izzy wasn't the only one worrying about the prospect. By the time the rest of the team had filed in, the buzz about what Anna might be going to share with the team had reached a dull roar. The meeting had been called before the unit opened for routine clinics, so Meg and the other receptionist, Gordon, who joined the unit at around the same time, had both come to the staff room for the update too. "So come on then, Anna, are we going to be closed down? Because I'll go down on record as Port Agnes Midwifery Unit's shortest-serving midwife if we do." Emily, who'd started at the unit as a maternity care assistant but had recently completed her training to become a midwife, asked the question on everyone's minds. No. Anna clearly didn't want to drag out the tension, and it wasn't until the tightness eased from Jess's shoulders that she realised quite how worried she'd been. There will be some integration in the services, but the unit won't be closing, and will still be able to offer home deliveries and the use of the birthing suite for our mums-to-be who don't need intervention. There will be opportunities for some staff to work across both sites, and for newly qualified midwives, like you, Emily, that could be a really good thing for extending your experience. Are you trying to get rid of me? Emily grinned. Not at all. But Bobby had already mentioned putting his name down for a split role if the opportunity came up, and I just thought you might be interested in doing the same thing. Anna turned towards Bobby, the only male midwife in the team, who also happened to be married to Tony. Are you still up for that? Bobby nodded. Absolutely. It'll be a great opportunity to widen my expertise, especially in terms of assisted deliveries. What Bobby forgot to mention is that the real reason he's doing it is to get a break from me and the kids. Tony rolled her eyes. We tossed a coin to see who'd get to put their name down first. A 12-hour night shift on the wards sounds like a doddle compared to staying at home with the kids. One of you should have told me we were mad for having a second one so quickly. You wouldn't have listened if we had. Frankie, one of the other midwives, laughed. You have to find out for yourself what having your hands full really feels like. And some of us got twins straight off the bat. Anna had won the parenting top trumps, and Jess swallowed hard. She couldn't think of anything she wanted more than having her hands full. Riley needed her far less than he had done when they first come into one another's lives. He was 8 now, and already limiting the number of times she could kiss him goodbye at the school gate to one very quick kiss on the top of his head. She'd never got to hold him in her arms as a baby, but there'd been another baby boy who felt like hers for a little while. Baby Teddy had been abandoned outside the front door to Jess's apartment, and she'd fostered him until he'd been moved to an adoptive family. It would have been a life-changing experience if it hadn't turned out that her ex-husband, Dom, was the baby's father. Riley had filled the gaping hole in her heart that had been left when she was forced to give Teddy up, but there was still an ache in the pit of her stomach to hold a baby in her arms and know that she didn't have to hand it over to its mother, because that would be her. Every time the IVF failed, she was more grateful than ever for the chance to be Riley's mum, but it couldn't completely take away the longing. Are you okay? Nadia, another of the midwives, who was also Frankie's daughter, touched Jess's arm lightly, keeping her voice low. Like the others on the team, she knew Jess's story, but she was the only one standing close enough to reach out. Jess had a feeling that her expression was giving away the fact that she was struggling, and the skin on her face felt like it was suddenly too tight when she tried to smile. I'm fine. Sometimes the rest of us take for granted how lucky we've been. Nadia squeezed Jess's arm again, her voice too low for anyone else to hear, and Jess gave an almost imperceptible nod, not trusting herself to say anything else. She didn't blame her friends for taking parenthood for granted, and the truth was, they probably didn't really. Anna had been through fertility treatment herself, and had all been involved in midwifery for long enough to know that becoming a mother wasn't possible for everyone. But she didn't want to be that person. Poor old Jess, the friend they couldn't grumble about the challenges of parenthood in front of in case she suddenly burst into tears. She told Nadia she was fine, and she was. She had to be. Is the completion date still December? Jess needed a change of subject, even if she had to create it herself. Yes, and they've appointed a hospital administrator already. She wants to meet with us to discuss a way forward for partnership working. Anna looked around the room. I've got to admit, I did have a little cry when I got the email saying we weren't just being swallowed up by the hospital, because this place and this team has meant so much to me. So they're definitely keeping the unit open. Jess tried to keep her tone casual, but she couldn't bear the thought of the unit closing either. She wouldn't have got through the last few years without it. The idea that the place which had become a second home and a second family to her might no longer be there wasn't one she could even contemplate. They are, but I don't know whether it'll be exactly the way it is now. Anna let go of a long breath. But we'll still be here, looking after the women and their babies who need us. We have to see integration and partnership working as a positive, because it means we won't automatically have to send our higher-risk patients straight to Truro for their care. I'm really pleased to hear that the news is this good, but now I've got loads of protest plans I'll never have the chance to carry out. Gwen had a twinkle in her eye, and Jess hardly dared ask, but knew she had to. You had protest plans? Oh, lots of them. But I was going to start by kayaking naked around Sisters of Agnes Island. In fact, I was going to suggest we all did. Someone would have harpooned me. It was Frankie's turn to laugh. But don't let us stop you, Gwen. You'll have plenty of time for new hobbies when you retire. Oh, I won't be wasting time kayaking, naked or otherwise. I'm going to be a magician's assistant. Gwen was totally deadpan, but Jess was still waiting for the punchline when Tony spoke. You're going to be a what? A magician's assistant. She shrugged as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Barry's always enjoyed doing magic at home, and we finally got the time to take it further. Oh my God, now I know you're serious. Frankie's eyes widened. You're talking about Barry performing magic at home and not even turning it into an innuendo? I'm deadly serious. We've already got a website. Gwen grabbed her phone. It's Barry the Magic Man and the Great Gwendini. We're taking bookings for kids' magic shows, but there's also an adult version. Okay, I definitely don't want to know what that involves. Jess didn't even want to picture it. Oh no, not that sort of magic. Barry only performs that for me. Gwen winked and Jess couldn't help laughing. The unit was going to be a very different place without her around. This is called mingle magic, and it's an icebreaker for parties and corporate events. We just promised to get the party started, that's all. Well, you've never let us down on that front, and it's just one of the things I'm going to miss about you. Anna exchanged a look with Jess, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Things were going to change at the unit, regardless of how the meeting with the hospital administrator went. It had been hard enough when Ella had left, but with some of the staff planning to split their time between the hospital and the unit, it was all going to be different very soon. Sometimes you didn't know what you had until it was gone, but like Anna, Jess already knew she was going to miss moments like these when the whole team got together. So, for now, she was determined to make the most of the time they had left. When the idea of the unit and the new hospital being integrated had first been raised, Anna had been keen to ensure the future of her team was protected. Part of that was to book some of the midwives who'd been in community midwifery the longest into refresher training. Jess, Tony and Bobby had also signed up to the NHS staff bank to pick up some extra shifts at the hospital in Truro. She was due to start a shift at the hospital 2 hours after the team meeting ended, but she wanted to catch up with Meg properly before she left. Are you okay? Jess stood by the reception desk where Meg was opening a box of leaflets. There were no patients yet, but the waiting area would start to fill up as the clinics got underway. I didn't sleep very well, trying to work out how on earth Tilly and Ed are going to manage financially, whether I should think about downsizing to release some money from the house to give to them. It's all going to be hers eventually anyway, but I just can't bear the thought of selling the house. As Meg looked at Jess, her eyes filled with tears. It's stupid, but part of me keeps thinking that Darren won't know where to find me if I move, and Seth will wonder where his room has gone. But it's not like they're ever coming back, is it? And Darren would have wanted me to make sure Tilly is okay. I'm just being selfish. That's the last thing you're being. It must be tough facing another stage of your life and not being able to share that with Darren and Seth. Jess was a hugger, and even some of her friends, like Tony, who weren't big on displays of affection, had got used to that over the years. Luckily, Meg seemed to appreciate it as a show of support, even though they hadn't known each other as long. You should be a therapist, you know, Meg sniffed. I kept crying last night, thinking that Darren won't even know he's going to be a granddad, and Seth won't get to be the fun uncle I know he would have been. I didn't think anyone would understand that. I felt like it so many times since Mum died. I was so young when she died, and it feels like she's missed every big milestone in my life. Some of them were heartbreaking, but some I'm almost grateful she didn't have to see, like the mess my divorce turned into. But part of me still wishes she'd been there. I'm probably not explaining it properly. You are. I know Darren would have been concerned about whether Tilly was rushing into this with Ed, just like I am. He fretted about the kids from the moment they were born, and he'd have been worried sick about her for the whole 9 months. It would have made him a nervous wreck, and I would have hated seeing him like that. But I'd still have liked to share it with him. It doesn't make any sense, does it? But I know exactly what you mean. And I can understand why you're worried. But I suppose you have to think about what the worst-case scenario could have been for the choices Tilly was facing. She and Ed might not go the distance, and things might be tough financially either way. But she'll get through it. And I can almost guarantee you'll both think it's all been worth it, because you'll have the baby in your lives. Jess held Meg's gaze. But if she decided not to have the baby now and discovered later on that the endometriosis had made her infertile, she might find herself filled with the sort of regret there's no way to get over. I know you're right, and I'm just glad she's okay. I was shocked that they were already trying not to mention the fact it had worked, but the training was perfectly timed. It really opened me up to another point of view, and you've helped me more than you'll ever know. I can see now that my rules for when Tilly is ready for a baby, with a mortgage and a marriage coming first, are just that, my rules. But I think Tilly is almost as shocked as I am, because she wasn't expecting it to happen quite this fast. They were playing Russian roulette with contraception, apparently. What does that mean? I didn't want any more details than what she'd told me, to be honest. Meg pulled a face. I know Tilly can't bear to think that her old mum might not be living like a nun anymore, and no one wants to think about their parents having a sex life. But it's no different when you're the parent. I want to pretend that Tilly and Ed's baby will be delivered by a stork. If I had to guess, I assume she means they don't always use contraception, and I know she decided to come off the pill to make sure it had completely left her system. At the risk of sounding like Gwen, I suppose that's one way of making a box of condoms last. Jess grinned, trying not to let her mind linger for too long on how easily some people found it to fall pregnant. She could play Russian roulette with contraception for the rest of her life and still have absolutely no chance of falling pregnant. She had to believe there was another path meant for her. She just wished she could turn off the almost primal urge that came over her whenever she held a newborn in her arms, to have a baby of her own. She felt guilty when she looked at Riley for wanting that so much. It was just hormones with nowhere to go. It would pass. It had to. I just want everything to be okay. Ever since Darren and Seth died, I've found it much harder to believe that things will go right. And I'm so worried about losing Tilly too. There was a catch in Meg's voice, and Jess reached out to touch her arm. She's young and healthy, and the perfect age to have a child from a biological point of view. It's going to be fine. It's not just the fear of losing her if something goes wrong. After the boy's accident, it was me and Tilly against the world. Since she met Ed in her first year of uni, things have been different. But now she's going to have a family of her own, and I'm scared of where that leaves me. She's going to need you more than ever. Jess had wanted to pick up the phone to her own mother 100 times since Riley had come into her life. There'd been so many questions, from whether the rash he had looked more like measles or chicken pox, or whether it was normal for him to sometimes call her by his new teacher's name. But Jess's mother had been gone a long time. Thankfully, she did have someone to turn to, though. Not long after he'd come back into Jess's life, her father had started a relationship with Frankie, who'd become like a second mum to Jess. If the IVF had worked, she'd have wanted every bit of support her father and Frankie could offer. I'm worried I won't know when to step in and when to step back. Meg shook her head. Just talk to her. I'm sure you'll feel 100 times better once you do, and so will she. Jess knew to her cost how wrong parents could get it when they tried to second-guess what they thought their children wanted. Her father, Guy, had got it into his head that she'd be better off without him after her mother had died. But staying away was the worst possible thing he could have done. You're a wise woman, Jess, and I'm really glad I've got someone I can talk to about all of this. Tilly doesn't want anyone to know about the baby until she's a bit further along. Poor Johnny, he'll probably run for the hills when he hears he's dating a soon-to-be grandmother. You're not worried about that, are you? Jess looked at Meg, who was already laughing. I think he knows what he's getting into already, what with all the symptoms that seem to have hit me these last few months. I feel like an old woman some mornings, and I thought I'd have at least another 5 years before I even had to think about the menopause, but now I'm not so sure. If Johnny can put up with that, I don't think he'll mind dating a nana. Sounds like he's got the makings of a keeper. One day, he'll realise that being with me means sacrificing stuff he doesn't even know he wants yet, Maybe when Tilly's baby arrives, it'll be a stark reminder of what I can never give him. Meg blew out her cheeks. But I try not to think too far ahead, because I know nothing's guaranteed. So if the flippin' menopause will let me, I'm just going to try to keep enjoying things with Johnny while they last. I'm sure Gwen would have some advice for you on that front. Jess couldn't help laughing at the look that crossed Meg's face. I dread to think. Me too, but somehow I still want to hear it. Jess touched her arm again. I'm glad you're feeling a bit better about it all, Meg, but you know where I am if you need me. I better head to Truro for my shift, otherwise I'm going to be late. See you later. See you later, and thanks for everything. It's really helped. No problem at all. Jess turned and headed for the door. She really was going to have to get going to make her shift in time, and she wanted to be as ready as possible to work in the new hospital, if she had to, when the time came. Chapter 4. When Jess had completed her midwifery training, it had been community midwifery that had won her heart. As much as she'd enjoyed working in hospitals, there was no way to build the same sort of relationships you could in the community. But there was a lot more variety in the types of delivery that took place in a hospital setting, and being able to care for high-risk patients was something she was looking forward to being able to do more of. Arriving at the maternity ward in Truro, Jess was assigned the care of a woman called Chrissy O'Brien, who was being induced at 42 weeks. Induction wasn't something that was offered at the birthing unit due to the increased risk of the patient needing an assisted delivery. According to her notes, this was Chrissy's first baby, and Jacinda, one of the full-time midwives at the hospital, briefed Jess on Chrissy's treatment so far. She'd already been at the hospital for 48 hours and had been given her second pessary to induce the labour, as well as a hormone drip to help speed up delivery now that the contractions had finally started. When Jess met her for the first time, it was clear Chrissy was feeling even more nervous about the delivery than the average mother-to-be, not to mention being completely exhausted. Hi Chrissy, I'm Jess, and I'm going to be taking over from Jacinda. Jess offered the other woman her most reassuring smile, but all Chrissy could do was grimace. Got a contraction. She gritted her teeth, and Jess moved to the head of the bed so she could see the monitor and give Chrissy as much support as she needed. Use the gas and air if you need it. That's good. Take slow, deep breaths. You're doing really well, and so is the baby. The readings on the monitor offered the reassurance that Jess needed. The baby was happy for now, but induced deliveries could often take longer, as well as being more painful than usual. It had clearly been a long couple of days for Chrissy already. I don't think I can keep doing this. Chrissy wasn't saying anything that Jess hadn't heard hundreds of times before, but she really did look like she was struggling. Is it the pain or the tiredness, or is there something else? Jacinda had mentioned that Chrissy's husband had needed to leave the hospital for a few hours because of other commitments. Although Jess was struggling to work out what could be more important than being at his wife's side, especially as they didn't have any other children. It might be the reason why Chrissy was starting to believe she couldn't do this. It feels like someone's trying to turn me inside out. Chrissy managed a half-smile for the first time. In a way, they sort of are. Jess had been surprised to discover that Chrissy hadn't already elected to have an epidural. Lots of patients being induced chose that option because of the likelihood of increased pain. Jess had always been keen not to make the women she cared for feel like they needed to be heroes. Did you talk to Jacinda about the possibility of having an epidural? I'm worried about it making things take even longer and the baby getting into distress. If my blood pressure goes low, it can slow down the baby's heartbeat too, can't it? Chrissy had clearly done her research, but Jess was hoping she could allay her fears. It can, but it's very unlikely to harm the baby in any way, and it might make the labour easier for you to deal with, which can help with your recovery time afterwards. I'm monitoring the baby closely, and if there's any change, I promise you we'll deal with it. You don't need to worry about any of that, but this has got to be up to you. I wish Alec would hurry up and get back so I can ask him what he thinks. Is that your partner? My husband. Chrissy nodded as she spoke, and Jess's scalp prickled. If a woman in labour needed pain relief, the last thing she should be doing was waiting for her husband's permission. Jess might be small, but she'd never been shy about speaking out when she needed to. Only you know how much pain you're in, So if you think an epidural will help, you don't need to ask anyone's permission.
Oh, no, it's not that.
Chrissy winced again as she shifted position.
I just need him to reassure me that I won't be failing if I have the epidural. I know you've already said it won't hurt the baby, but I wanted to do this all as naturally as possible. Alec has been telling me all the way through that it doesn't matter as long as me and the baby are both okay at the end of it, but I could do with hearing that again now.
Would it help if we called him? Jess might have misjudged Alec, but she still couldn't believe there was somewhere more important he needed to be right now than by his wife's side.
He should be back soon. He wasn't going to go, but I didn't want us both to miss Amelia's big day.
Amelia? Jess suddenly wondered if she'd misread the notes and Chrissy did have another child after all.
We're foster carers, and Amelia was one of the babies we had placed with us. Today her adoption is being finalised and they're having a ceremony to celebrate. We were both invited, and I was originally hoping I'd be taking the new baby to meet them, but obviously this little one had other plans.
Chrissy smiled, and Jess was relieved to hear that she got Alec all wrong.
The contractions are agony now, but they're still a long way apart, so I figured the baby's unlikely to put in an appearance any time soon, and fostering's really important to us. I was a foster carer for a little while, but I found it too hard to let go.
Jess still had to blink back tears whenever she thought of Teddy. She'd fallen in love with the little boy the moment she discovered him on her doorstep. Somehow, even after all this time, her arms still ached with emptiness when she pictured his face.
I was like that with the little boy we looked after for almost 2 years, until just after he turned 6. But what made it worse was that we gave notice on the placement, so I felt massively guilty as well. We just found it overwhelming, never getting a break from the challenging behaviours he had, but oh my God!
Chrissy screwed up her face as the pain took over her body again. Like I said before, the gas and air might help, but if you really want to avoid using it, just use your breathing instead. Breathe in through your nose, and when you breathe out again, some women find it helpful to sigh. Don't feel like you have to keep fighting against the pain, though. It really is okay to ask for some help. Chrissy shook her head, breathing in deeply and then sighing, just as Jess had instructed, 3 times. Her whole face changed as the contraction finally passed, and it was suddenly as though she was just casually passing the time with small talk. When Jess had first started training, she'd been surprised at how, in the earlier stages of labour, some women could be in absolute agony 1 minute and back to talking normally the next. Sometimes when the patient had an epidural in, you'd never even guess they were in labour.